Well, good evening, and welcome to Trinity Heights' second mezzanine event. Thank you so much for coming out. We're delighted to see all of you here this evening, and thank you for all of you who worked so hard to put this event on for us this evening. We're very grateful. I'd kind of like to start this evening by repeating myself, if that's okay, for the sake of those who weren't here last time. A kind of statement of purpose, if you will. My hopes and aims for these kind of sessions, these evenings together, is not to give a comprehensive Christian response to all of the different topics we're going to be looking at together in this series. I don't think that's possible in 25-minute talks. My aim is also not to give, to thoroughly convince a thoroughgoing skeptic of every claim of the Christian faith and every claim the church makes. Partly because, as I said last time, and I mean this, I'm not sure about every claim that the church makes, right? But thankfully my hopes and ambitions for these sessions together are a lot more modest than that. My hope is that we'll generate a better discussion between church and culture. We'll generate a better discussion between church and culture. And my hope for these sessions together is that we'll create a space where skeptics and believers can talk about the big questions of life, the universe, and everything, openly and honestly, to steal a phrase from Douglas Adams. So that said, let's turn to our subject for this evening. The title of our talk this evening is "We Suffer, So There Is No God." Well, Christians claim that God is good. They also claim that God is all-powerful. But look at the world, it's a mess, and it is full of evil, and it is full of suffering. How is this possible? This is the problem known as theodicy. Theodicy, that's a technical name for it. I say it's a problem. I mean, it's a problem for Christians, and it's a problem for most theists, I know. But if, on the other hand, we live in a godless universe which is coldly indifferent to our condition, then perhaps all there is left to do is to shrug our shoulders with the universe and carry on. It is what it is. No. It's people who insist on God in the face of suffering. It's people who insist on God in the face of evil. This is a problem for them. Of course, I could try and resolve the dilemma a little bit by saying something like, well, as human beings, we have free will, and we have a choice to make. And way back when, our ancestors made the wrong choice, and we've been doing that ever, making bad decisions ever since. But over here, we might say, push back on that and say, well, wait a second, I thought you said God was good. Yes. And wouldn't a good God make good people? Yes. So why are good people made by a good God making such bad decisions? What sort of offense to reason is that? Of course, over here I might push back and say, well, wait, actually, if you look at most of the problems and suffering in this world, it's actually due to man's inhumanity to man. Well, that may be true, you say, but on this side you may want to push back and say, well, wait a second, that may be true, but what about disease? And what about earthquakes and natural disasters and that sort of, how is that our fault? And so you see, we could go back and forth for some time this evening in this rather speculative, somewhat theoretical approach to the subject of suffering. Somewhat detached from the puzzle that we're working on. But my gut feeling is that the moment that we think we've solved the puzzle, we'll actually find a piece left over in our hand that we're not actually sure what to do with and where it goes. Or here's another scenario, okay? Try this. What if we came up with a set of answers that all of us were pleased with this evening? I mean, we're not going to do that, right? Obviously. But imagine that we did. We came up with a set of answers that all of us were thoroughly convinced by and pleased with this evening. I'm not sure a set of answers to all of our curious philosophical questions about suffering even begin to approach an appropriate response to someone who is actually suffering. Let's say a friend of ours. Mm-hmm. You see, in this discussion, I don't want to lose sight of the fact that suffering is embodied and it is located. It's embodied. In other words, suffering happens to someone, somewhere. So in an attempt not to talk about this subject in too much of a detached, somewhat theoretical, speculative manner, I want to frame our discussion this evening by telling you first of all about a friend of mine. Some of you have heard me talk about him before. His name is Celestin Musakura. This is him right here. So you can put a face to a name. face. Celestin is a pastor from Rwanda, and when the Rwandan genocide happened, he was actually living and working in Kenya, in Nairobi, Kenya at the time, and 2 million people were slaughtered, and countless refugees poured across the border from Kenya from Rwanda into Kenya. When we first met Celestin, he and his wife and his 4 children were sharing their 3-bedroom home with 32 refugees. You do the math: 3 bedrooms, 32 refugees. They had mattresses everywhere. There were mattresses even across the kitchen floor as well. They shared their food, their clothes, their money, everything they had. They shared with these people. Some of them had been so badly damaged that they couldn't speak anymore. Some of them had survived by hiding and pretending to be dead, playing dead amongst the dead bodies of their friends and family, their husbands and wives, their brothers and sisters. Which is actually what Celestin's own mother had to do. His father was not so fortunate, if that's the word. Since then, Celestin has devoted his life to a work of reconciliation amongst warring tribes and factions in different parts of Africa, training up civic leaders, training up religious leaders for this work of reconciliation, peacemaking. Celestin's organization now works in 8 different African countries, and sometimes he's been arrested and interrogated, and on several occasions he's been tortured in places like Sudan. Never quite sure if he was going to walk out of those death camps alive. Suffering was not something that was new to Celestin, because as a kid, when he was thrown out, when he became a Christian and he said, I'm going to be a follower of this Jesus person, he was thrown out of his family home, and he survived on the streets by begging and was often going hungry as a kid. Now, I share this snapshot of Celestin's life, and it's a snapshot, right? Because the moment a guy like that's going to have a lot of stories. But I share this snapshot of Celestin's life because I don't want to give responses, Christian responses to this question of suffering, somewhat speculative, abstract responses, which may work more or less in our context, but can't actually translate into a context like that, cross-culturally. Look, all of us here have suffered in some way, shape, or form to varying degrees, to one degree or another. And I don't think it would be a helpful or healthy thing if we started bringing out our suffering and comparing it with each other today, creating a scale. So I don't think that would be healthy. But so I have no interest in belittling or diminishing anyone's and the reality of anyone's suffering here this evening. And so I'll just say this on my own behalf. Celestin has suffered far more than I ever have, and he has seen suffering and evil up close in a way that I have not. And so my hope is that perhaps by sharing some responses that have made sense to a guy like that in that context, and some of the things I'm going to share tonight are things I've heard straight from him, by sharing those kinds of Christian responses that have made sense to a guy like that in that context, maybe, just maybe, these responses might be meaningful to us as well. So yeah, Celestin and his family were visiting us in the UK some years ago. We had a great time. They stayed with us for a few weeks. And one day, while he's staying with us, he gets into this taxi cab, and on the dashboard of the cab is this photo of a young boy, no older than 8 or 9 years old. And it turns out that this is the son of the taxi driver who had died 2 or 3 years earlier. And apparently over the years, as different people had got into the cab, whenever religious types, right, got into the cab, he would interrogate them. And he'd ask them the question. He said, if there is a God, and God is so good, why did my son have to die so young? And he had various different responses over the years. But he said one of the worst responses he got was from some Christians who said to him, well, the reason why your son had to die so young was because God needed him more than you did. How do you think he responded? I'll tell you how he responded. He got mad. And I share his anger and his angst over that kind of response because it's kitsch. It's kitsch. You know what kitsch is, right? It's this kind of saccharine glaze over everything. It's superficial, it's shallow. Someone described it the other day to me as Hallmarky. You know, the Hallmark channel, the Hallmark movies. I thought that was a great description of kitsch. It's kitsch. It puts saccharine gloss over this man's pain and anguish and suffering, and it turns away from what it doesn't want to see, from what it doesn't want to look at. It's kitsch. Do you know that some Christians pity atheists because they wonder if atheists understand the tragedy that life is in a godless universe. They wonder if atheists understand how tragic life becomes without God. Well, I want to turn that question back on some of those Christians and ask them, does your version of God make you utterly insensitive to the tragedy in people's lives? Does your version of God rob you of any tragic sense of life? You see, I think many of these atheists are very well aware, not all, but many are very well aware of how tragic life is without God. They're painfully aware of it, but we mustn't miss the fact that there is a kind of nobility, there's a kind of heroism in recognizing this tragedy and facing it head on. That they feel heroic, they feel they're courageous, and most of all, they feel like they're being honest. They feel like they're being honest. So this kind of hero doesn't need our pity. And frankly, if faced between the kind of kitsch response that was given to that taxi driver about the death of his son, or having to choose between that or embracing a tragic sense of life, you know, some days I think I'd rather embrace a tragic sense of life. There's something a little bit more noble and admirable, more attractive about it. Of course, Christians aren't the only people who deal in kitsch. Sometimes atheists do it too. Right after Julia and I left London, there was a campaign of bus ads that was sponsored by the British Atheistic Humanist Society and Richard Dawkins. You know Richard Dawkins, a famous Oxford biologist, the selfish gene, and very vocal atheist, part of what they call the new atheists. And one of the banners on the buses read this: "There's probably no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life." And there's Richard Dawkins right there. It's funny, right? But then again, it's not. Try saying that to someone like that taxi driver who's just lost his 8-year-old boy. Try saying that to Celestin while he's being tortured in the Sudan. Try saying that to the girl who goes home and faces abuse every night. Try saying that to the people who were living in Celestin's home who had survived by hiding among the dead bodies of their friends and family. You see, as the British essayist Francis Spufford has pointed out, it's not the bit that says there's probably no God that's offensive. That's a philosophical possibility. Of course it is. And that's not the offensive bit. It's the next bit that says now stop worrying and enjoy your life. That's the offensive bit, because it comes from a certain kind of sheltered privilege, and it's just kitsch. Well, Celestin's response to this taxi driver, let's jump back in that cab for a second, okay? So Celestin's response to that cab driver was not, well, God probably needed your son more than you did, or don't worry, your son's in heaven, or he's got some post-mortem bliss, the variations on the same theme, right? It also was not, well, there's probably no God, now stop worrying and just enjoy your life, right? It wasn't that either. Someone who's been through what he's been through couldn't say that. It wasn't either of those things. Here's what he did. He just asked him a question. And he said, have you ever told God how angry you are that your son died so young? Have you ever told him how wrong it is that he died at age 8? Have you ever let your anger spill over into rage? Have you ever let God have it? Have you ever done that? And the taxi driver became very quiet. It wasn't a response that I was expecting. It certainly wasn't a response he was expecting. And he became very quiet. And through tears, he said that he had not. And that he wasn't sure if it was okay for him to do so. See, here's an interesting thing. I think many people have been made to feel that to bring these complaints and to raise these questions is the grounds of unbelief. That to ask these questions is an attack on faith itself. Author Stanley disagrees, and it's not because he's a Christian, because he's not. He's looking at the Bible as a literary theorist, and here's what he says. He says, these objections about suffering that skeptics make to religious thinking are themselves part of religious thinking. Rather than being swept under the rug of a seamless discourse, they are the very motor of that discourse, impelling the conflicted questioning of theologians and poets, not to mention Jesus, who cried, my God, why have you forsaken me?" and every verse of the book of Job. See, some people are of the opinion that these questions come from outside the biblical narrative, but actually they're right there on the inside. In fact, they're crucial to the biblical plotline, and they're crucial for moving the biblical narrative forward. And if they're not being asked explicitly, they're always bubbling right there beneath the surface. They're right there beneath the surface. But here's the strange thing about the Bible. Rather than taking our language away from us, silencing our questions, stifling our doubts, stuffing them down in some deep, dark recess of our hearts, rather than taking our language away from us, the Bible actually provides the language that we need to ask these questions, raise our doubts, and bring our complaints against God. The Bible creates an intellectual space for us to wrestle with these things, not alone, but with God and before God. Let me give you just a kind of a quick taste of what I'm talking about. Just a few verses from Psalm 44. You crushed us and made us a haunt for jackals. You covered us over with deep darkness. Why do you hide your face and forget our misery and oppression? We are brought down to the dust. Our bodies cling to the ground. Why do you hide your face and forget our misery and oppression? Now, for those of you, this may come as a surprise for any of you who've ever stepped foot in a church before. I know some of you have. Because sometimes when you go to these churches, not always, but sometimes these Christians all seem very happy-clappy, right? And they've got these pasted-on smiles, right? These forced grins. Not always, but sometimes, right? What's going on? Well, theologian Walter Brueggemann, he says this. He says the church's popular spirituality is highly selective in the psalms used and often quite romantic in its understanding of them. The liturgical practice of the church tends to make use of only the positive and nice psalms that support the church's rather polite interpretation of Scripture and reality. This is an odd inclination for passionate Bible users, given the large number of psalms that are songs of lament, protest, and complaint about the incoherence that is experienced in the world. The church that goes on singing happy songs in the face of reality is doing something very different from what the Bible actually does. So the point is this: if you've ever been made to feel that asking these kinds of questions and bringing these complaints comes from outside faith, it's actually the opposite. It's the moment you start asking these questions and taking them very seriously that you find yourself quite at home in the biblical narrative, because this is where these questions are asked the loudest, and sometimes they're not asked, they are shouted. Now, you might ask, well, why in a book about God, why in a book supposedly pro-God and promoting God, are these questions there at all? Why in a book about God, a book supposedly pro-God, would these questions be there, and why are they sometimes not asked but they're actually shouted? Well, I think the Christian would turn the question around and say, well, does it make sense to bring these complaints and raise these questions anywhere else? Perhaps, maybe, perhaps it's only with God that our sense of oughtness, oughtness as in things ought to be this way, things ought not to be that way, right? This ought to happen, this ought never to happen. Celestin ought never to be tortured in the Sudan. These people ought never to hide among the dead bodies of their friends and family. The girl ought never to be abused when she goes home. That taxi driver's son ought never to have died at the age of 8, right? Our sense of oughtness. Perhaps it's only with God that our sense of oughtness and our sense of justice has any substance. You see, apart from God, I think our sense of oughtness and our sense of justice and our ideas about good and evil are ultimately reduced to cultural conventions, which are the result of chemical reactions going on in the brain, which are the result of aeons of genetic mutations that have happened down through the centuries and the millennia, right? But genetic mutations, chemical reactions in the brain, which then result in the kind of a cultural manifestation, are not enough to endow these legitimate this sense of oughtness and justice with the seriousness and gravity they deserve. It's interesting, the Bible doesn't seem to be that interested in answering it doesn't seem that interested in answering all of our philosophical questions about suffering, but it does seem interested in this question. What is God going to do about it? What is God going to do next? If the world is full of injustice and is full of suffering and things are not as it ought to be, can God do anything about it? And will God do anything about it? What is God going to do next? And in the end, what we find is that the entire Christian narrative actually converges at this point. The entire Christian narrative converges on this question that we're looking at tonight of innocent suffering. It's not just that it's there bubbling beneath the surface, but it focuses on that, because all of our questions about death and suffering, about justice and injustice and evil, they are focused, they are intensified, they are radicalized in the death of Jesus Christ on the cross. And the question becomes, what is God going to do about this death? What is God going to do about this particular suffering and this particular injustice and evil? Now, I know that some of you right now would say, I don't care. Why would I care about the death of particularly care about the death of a Jewish teacher 2,000 years ago in the backwaters of the Roman Empire? What has that got to do with me? That's why I'm not asking you to care, and I'm certainly not asking you to believe this evening. I'm not going there. I just want to make sure we get the story straight. Okay? So what does God do about this? Is God's response heaven when you die, this blissful post-mortem experience in some other place far away from this nasty old world? Because if it is, then no wonder Karl Marx condemns Christianity for being the opium of the people. Right? And we're back to kitsch. Well, this some blissful post-mortem experience far away from this nasty old world, we're back to kitsch. But strangely enough, that's not actually the response you will ever find in the Bible. The Bible hardly touches on the idea of us going to heaven when we die. In fact, the Bible hardly seems interested in our immediate post-mortem experience. You go back and reread it carefully. It's hardly there. What it does, this is the response it does give. It says this. It says, on the third day, God raised Jesus from the dead. Now, that's the moment where we'll go, okay, you've lost me, because that's lunacy. Now we're in crazy town. We all know dead people stay dead. This is not what dead people... So you're just talking nonsense now, okay? And that's why it would probably be a really good idea right now to present all the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and was to at least explain why the resurrection of Jesus Christ is the only hypothesis that actually takes into account all the data, the historical data that there is, and has any explanatory power. Unfortunately, we don't have time. But I can at least allude to the fact that there are people in academic circles, places like the University of Cambridge, where people have come to believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ, not because they believe in the inspiration of the Bible, because they don't believe it's inspired, but simply because they're good historians. In other words, this is open to historical investigation. Any other historical hypothesis, we put it to the same test. And so the invitation is there for you to do the same. Now, while I haven't got the time to present all the evidence, I do want to close here with just a paragraph about the meaning of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The resurrection of Jesus is a promise. It's a promise from God that says, look, just as God has raised Jesus from the dead, restoring, reclaiming, redeeming his life from the pit, just as God has reversed the effects of death and suffering and evil and injustice that was worked out on Jesus, just as he's reversed the effects of all that in his bodily resurrection, so too God wants to do this and will do this one day for the rest of his creation. And please understand, this is not about some restitution, this is about restoration. It's not about restitution someplace else far away from this nasty old world. This is about restoration of wholeness and justice right here. Well, let me just briefly summarize what we said this evening. What have we said? First, we've acknowledged that suffering can't just be talked about in abstract theoretical terms. Second, we've acknowledged some theistic and atheistic approaches to suffering amount to nothing more than kitsch. Third, we've said that doubts and questions because of suffering are not an attack on faith, but come from within faith, and that the Bible provides a language for this sort of question. Fourth, the reason why these questions are articulated the most clearly in Scripture is because it's only before God that our sense of justice and oughtness is legitimated, and it's only before God that it makes sense to expect something to be done about it. Fifth, the entire Christian faith actually converges on the question of innocent suffering with the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. And finally, the resurrection of Jesus is taken by Christians to be a promise, not of heaven when we die, but a promise that what God has done in reversing the effects of suffering, injustice, and death in Jesus, God can, and one day will also do for the rest of his creation. Let me add one more thought. the resurrection, I said, is a promise. It's also an invitation. It's a promise, but it also becomes an invitation and a framework within which it makes sense for us to partner with God now, to partner and work with God today for his future reality, or as the way we've been saying it, the way that you and I, the way we know things ought to